The year was 1919, a world exhausted and scarred, teetering between hope and despair. The echoes of gunfire had finally faded, replaced by a fragile silence, a silence that everyone desperately hoped would last. The Great War, the war to end all wars, was finally over, and the world dared to dream of a lasting peace, a future free from the horrors they had just endured. Celebrations erupted across nations, fueled by relief and the promise of a brighter tomorrow. In the opulent Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, a symbol of French grandeur and history, Allied leaders, the victors of the war, gathered with the weighty task of drafting a treaty. They believed, or at least hoped, that this treaty would not just end a war, but create a new world order, a system that would prevent such devastation from ever happening again. But the Treaty of Versailles, despite its lofty ambitions, became a blueprint not for peace, but for future conflict, a breeding ground for resentment and instability. Its noble goals, like establishing the League of Nations, an organization intended to foster international cooperation and prevent future wars, and redrawing Europe's map, reshaping borders, and creating new nations in the wake of empires, were tragically overshadowed by deep-seated anger, a thirst for revenge, and a desire for retribution against the defeated powers, particularly Germany. The treaty was not a genuine negotiation, a collaborative effort to build a lasting peace. It was in essence a verdict, a harsh sentence delivered by the victorious Allied powers upon the vanquished. France, having suffered immense devastation and loss during the war, understandably wanted security above all else, and a measure of revenge for the sacrifices they had made. Britain, while seeking to maintain a balance of power in Europe, also faced intense public pressure at home to punish Germany severely for its role in the conflict. America's idealistic vision for a just and equitable peace, championed by President Woodrow Wilson, was largely sidelined in the face of European pragmatism and vengeful sentiment. The result was a flawed compromise, a treaty focused more on punishment and retribution than on genuine reconciliation and long-term stability. The treaty's architects, blinded by the immediate aftermath of the war, failed to fully grasp that humiliating a nation, stripping it of its pride and economic stability, only sows the seeds of future conflict and resentment. Instead of fostering healing and understanding, the Treaty of Versailles inadvertently ensured that the pain, resentment, and humiliation felt by the German people would fester and grow, poisoning the well of European peace. It merely pressed pause on the underlying conflicts, a temporary ceasefire rather than a genuine and lasting end to hostilities. The deep wounds of World War I, far from being healed, were instead salted with injustice and resentment, ensuring they would continue to fester within a mere 2 decades. The world would be forced to pay the devastating price for this short-sighted and ultimately punitive peace, a peace that sowed the seeds of its own destruction. The fundamental question remains, even a century later, was Versailles truly a peace treaty, a genuine attempt to build a better future? Or was it in reality merely the opening act of an even greater tragedy, a prelude to the horrors of World War II? The Hall of Mirrors, a glittering symbol of French power and prestige, was deliberately chosen as the location for this momentous occasion. It was here, in this very hall, that the German Empire had been proclaimed in 1871, a moment of profound national triumph for Germany. Now the tables have turned. Where Germany once celebrated victory, basking in the glow of newfound imperial power, it now faced utter humiliation. The symbolism was impossible to ignore, a stark reminder of their defeat. The German delegation wasn't invited to negotiate the terms of their surrender. They were treated as pariahs, kept isolated and excluded from the discussions that would determine their nation's future. Instead, they were summoned to sign a document they had no hand in shaping, a treaty dictated by the victorious Allied powers. They were presented with a fait accompli, a set of demands they were powerless to alter. The Treaty of Versailles went far beyond simply ending the war. It fundamentally dismantled Germany as a major power on the world stage. It achieved this by stripping it of vast swathes of territory land that had been considered German for generations. It also targeted Germany's industrial heartland, crippling its economy. And perhaps most damaging of all, it attacked the nation's pride. Millions of Germans suddenly found themselves as minorities overnight in newly formed countries, separated from their homeland and placed under foreign rule. The once mighty German military was gutted, reduced to a shadow of its former self, and the Rhineland, a vital industrial region, was occupied by Allied forces, a constant reminder of their defeat. The nation's honor was shattered, its spirit broken. In the lead-up to the armistice, Germans had been led to believe they had agreed to a fair and just peace, one based on President Wilson's idealistic 14 points. Instead, what they received was a harsh and dictated settlement that completely ignored those principles, a punitive treaty designed to keep Germany weak and subservient. The vast gap between the promise of Wilson's vision and the bitter reality of Versailles fueled a powerful and enduring sense of betrayal among the German people. This narrative of victimhood, of being unfairly treated and unjustly punished, would haunt Germany for years to come, shaping its politics and its national identity. Versailles was far more than just a redrawing of borders on a map. It was a deep and lasting national humiliation, a wound that would fester for decades. The seeds of resentment, of anger and bitterness were sown deep within the German psyche, waiting for the opportunity to sprout. Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, forced Germany to accept sole responsibility for the war. For Germans, this was an outrageous lie. They saw themselves as defending their homeland. The clause justified reparations, territorial losses, and military restrictions. It turned Germany from a defeated adversary into a convicted criminal. The reality of the war's origins was far more complex, with many nations sharing blame. This forced confession united Germans in outrage and became a rallying cry for those seeking to overturn the treaty. The War Guilt Clause was not reconciliation. It was a declaration of moral superiority. It ensured that resentment, not cooperation, would define post-war relations. The economic terms of Versailles devastated Germany. Reparations were set at an astronomical sum, designed to keep Germany weak for generations. The country, already ruined by war, lost its richest industrial regions and colonies forced to pay. Germany printed money, triggering hyperinflation. By 1923, the mark was worthless, savings vanished, and the middle class was destroyed. Economic chaos eroded trust in the Weimar Republic and fueled extremism. Desperate and angry, Germans blamed their government, the Allies, and minorities. Radical parties promised to tear up Versailles and restore pride. The treaty's economic punishment brought not peace, but misery and rage. This suffering paved the way for Hitler's rise. Versailles crippled Germany and set the stage for disaster. Versailles' hypocrisy extended far beyond the borders of Europe, casting a long shadow on the aspirations of people across the globe. The principles of self-determination so loudly proclaimed seemed to apply selectively during the First World War. The Allies, desperate for any advantage, made a series of promises to Arab leaders, offering the tantalizing prospect of Arab independence in exchange for a revolt against the Ottoman Empire. These promises were whispered in back rooms and formalized in written agreements. Inspired by these promises and fueled by a desire for self-determination, Arab leaders rose up in revolt, fighting alongside the Allies for liberation from Ottoman rule. They envisioned a future free from foreign control. They fought, believing in a unified Arab state, a single nation stretching across the Middle East, where Arabs could govern themselves and control their own destiny. This vision was the driving force behind their sacrifices. But as the war drew to a close, and the victorious Allies gathered to carve up the spoils, it became painfully clear that these promises, so freely given, were in reality empty gestures. The Allies, blinded by imperial ambition, saw the Middle East not as a region deserving of freedom and self-governance, but as a prize to be divided amongst themselves, a new source of resources and strategic advantage. It was not a region to free, but a territory to control. The promises of liberation were conveniently forgotten in the pursuit of colonial gains. Arab delegations, filled with hope and expectation, arrived at Versailles, seeking recognition of their wartime sacrifices and the establishment of self-rule, eager to participate in the New World Order. But their pleas, their arguments, their very presence were largely ignored by the European powers, who had already decided the fate of the region behind closed doors. Self-determination, the guiding principle of the post-war era, was selectively applied. It was granted to Europeans, allowing them to forge their own nations and destinies, but it was systematically denied to the Arabs, who were deemed incapable of governing themselves and were instead subjected to foreign rule. The dream of independence, so vividly imagined and so fiercely fought for, was brutally crushed under the weight of imperial ambition and political expediency. Britain and France, far from being liberators, became the new imperial masters, dividing the region into spheres of influence and imposing their will upon its people. This betrayal, this broken promise, poisoned relations between the West and the Arab world for generations to come, sowing the seeds of resentment and mistrust. The Arab revolt's reward for its sacrifices and its loyalty was not the freedom and self-determination it had been promised, but a new era of foreign domination, an era marked by broken promises and unfulfilled aspirations. The legacy of these broken promises, of this profound betrayal, would continue to haunt the region, shaping its conflicts and influencing its destiny for decades to come. The betrayal of the Arabs was premeditated. In 1916, Britain and France secretly agreed to divide the Middle East. The Sykes-Picot Agreement. Arbitrary borders ignored ethnic and religious realities, lumping rivals together and splitting communities apart. The mandate system formalized colonial control, not self-rule. These artificial borders sowed chaos, fueling decades of conflict. The legacy of Sykes-Picot is instability and distrust that endures to this day. Versailles' failures fueled radicalism, not peace in Germany. The treaty discredited democracy and empowered extremists like the Nazis. Hitler's promise to tear up Versailles and restore honor resonated with a humiliated, desperate population. The treaty's injustices became Nazi propaganda in the Middle East. Betrayal led to disillusionment and the rise of radical ideologies. Western-imposed states were seen as illegitimate, sparking resistance and political Islam. The broken promises of Versailles convinced many that only rejection of the West could bring liberation. The treaty created unstable states and fueled the radical movements that would challenge them. Versailles' legacy was not peace, but a world prime for extremism. The echoes of Versailles and Sykes-Picot still shape the modern world. Western interventions in the Middle East, like the 2003 Iraq invasion, repeated old mistakes, ignoring local realities and creating chaos. Promises of democracy often lead to failed states and resentment. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is another legacy of conflicting promises and broken trust. Calls for peace are met with suspicion, seen as maneuvers to maintain Western dominance. To understand today's conflicts, we must remember the century-old story of betrayal and broken promises. Versailles was meant to end war, but punishment and humiliation only paused the violence. By seeking vengeance, the Allies created the conditions for an even greater conflict. The treaty's burdens fueled Hitler's rise and made another war inevitable. In the Middle East, arbitrary borders and denied independence bred instability and distrust. Versailles teaches that peace cannot be dictated or based on revenge. True peace requires respect, negotiation, and a willingness to heal. When peace is used as punishment, it plants the seeds of future wars. Only reconciliation, not retribution, can break the cycle of violence.
If you believe military history shaped our world, then you've already joined the force. Hit like, subscribe, and share the mission. Shadow Force continues, and the next chapter awaits.